Wrestling with God. I wish you all could have known my Uncle Eddie. He was family, and I might even argue a national treasure. He wasn't actually my uncle. He was my great-uncle, married to my grandfather's sister on my mother's side. But Uncle Eddie had arrived with his family in America when he was 6 years old from eastern Italy. His parents had decided to look for a better life, and they had moved to New York City. I loved visiting my Uncle Eddie and Aunt Laura at their beautiful home on the banks of the Severn River just north of Annapolis, Maryland. He was a master storyteller, and did he have stories? He loved to tell of his childhood when he would run errands for his father, who was a tailor, and he would ride the New York subway. 8, 9 years old, big stashes of cash, and he would have to avoid all the robbers to deliver the money for his father. He would tell of how his father actually had business dealings with Joe Kennedy before Jack became president there in New York City. He would tell of his adventures on his educational path to getting his doctorate in mechanical engineering from Kansas State University, and how he met my great aunt during his time there. He would tell of the story his first job as an engineer was to improve the production of marshmallows at a marshmallow factory. And how he got hired after that to work for Chevrolet on the prototype of the Corvette. He would tell of how in 1960 he would be hired by NASA as a young engineer, and how he would work his way up the ladder at NASA and become the deputy to the chief of the Goddard Space Flight Center's Advanced Mission Analysis Office. He had many responsibilities there, and he would tell me about them. How he managed the $500 million orbiting geophysical observatory project, and also the Solar Optical Telescope project for NASA. One of his favorite projects he would tell me about is when NASA was charged with going to the Bermuda Triangle in their ocean bathymetry experiment, which was done with famous oceanographer Jacques Cousteau and Jack Ford, the son of the president at that time, Gerald Ford, and astronaut Rusty Schweickart. He would tell me of when they called him and told him he was going to be in charge of that project. And Uncle Eddie had a colorful vocabulary growing up in New York City. He said, "What in the world are they hiring me to do this for? I know nothing about it." But they ended up mapping the bottom of the floor, the ocean floor there for the Bermuda Triangle. He had great stories from that time. Uncle Eddie, I thought, had lived one of the most exciting lives of anybody I knew. And he exemplified a great success story of immigration to America. I usually left his house there in Maryland with some pictures of Earth from outer space and the satellites he would send up, or some pictures of him with celebrities talking about his work at NASA. Every time I was there, he would tell me different stories, but the one story he would invariably tell me concerned when he was in second grade in New York City. He was new to this country, he was trying to make it, but he was struggling with English, and he wasn't doing well in school. And after turning in one of his projects, a particularly poorly done assignment, to his teacher turned and looked at him and unceremoniously, before the whole class, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Eddie, you are the stupidest student I've ever had in my class." Eddie told that story with the pathos of a story happening like 2 hours before I got there, instead of the 50 to 60 years ago that it had happened. He remembered that story with the vividness of a broken second grade student's memory. He was stupid. And he spent the rest of his life trying to overcome that stereotype that his teacher had given him. Now, Eddie ended up mastering English, In fact, he would tell me that the head of NASA, sometimes before he would go and speak before Congress or go to the White House to give a speech, would sometimes come and bring his speech to Eddie to have him proofread it because he mastered English so well. One of the things he told me, I remember last time I saw him, he ended up being a chain smoker, probably from the stress of all of his work and probably battling with always trying to prove that he wasn't stupid. And he took his cigarette and he threw it on the ground and he stomped it. And he said, I wish that, and again, I can't say all the words he said, I wish that teacher were alive today so I could show her what I've become. Wrestling with an identity that you get as a child. Researchers now know that child trauma, child neglect, leaves lasting imprints even on the imaging of our brain when they do MRIs. If children have gone through the trauma of war or domestic abuse, that their brains actually become different and don't function as children in nurturing Christian normal environments. Childhood identity. Today we're going to look at a story of a boy named Deceiver, Jacob. Can you imagine what it would be like? And we're going through his story of ever since you were a child, ever since you were born, of every time somebody calls you, you are reminded that you are a deceiver. And guess what happens in the story? He becomes a deceiver. And he also gets deceived. So we start in Genesis chapter 31, and we're working up to the seminal moment of Jacob's life. And in chapter 31, verse 3, God actually tells Jacob, it's time to go home. Now, he should have been excited to go home, right? After 20 years of not being home, and he gets to go home. However, let's think about this. His beloved mother was already dead, so he wasn't going to be able to see her. The last time he'd seen his father, well, he'd had goat hair on his arms, and he was trying to cheat his brother out of his birthright, and he was deceiving his dad, so, well, how's that going to go? And his brother, who did get deceived out of the birthright, was wanting to kill him. So he gets to go home, and God is taking him into this situation. He's like, okay, but I guess he agrees to it because things weren't going so well with Laban either. So he decided, the deceiver decided it was time to go home after, guess what, getting deceived. Laban had deceived him multiple times. Now there's something that in Eastern religions they call karma. I think you've all heard of that. And you can see why sometimes people get that idea, because I think God, in His mercy, allows us to spend time with people who are a lot like us and have some of the same sins we do. And we get to learn firsthand how unpleasant it is spending time with people that might have the same faults of character that we do. And Jacob had probably had enough of being deceived. And now it's time for the deceiver to go back home and face the music. Well, Laban, it had gotten so bad, you can read about it in chapter 31, it got so bad that Jacob actually just leaves under the cover of night. He doesn't tell Laban he's leaving. He just takes off because he doesn't want him to, protest, and they didn't have a very good relationship. So he just gets his wives, all his possessions, his children, and he heads out. And you can read about in chapter 31, Laban's like, what? He took off without me knowing it, and he takes off after him. So here he is already. God has called him to this. He's going out. He's already got a problem. His father-in-law's coming, and they're going to have a fight. And sure enough, Laban does catch up. They fight. Turns out Rachel had stolen one of the household gods. Even one of his wives was half pagan, half believer in Yahweh. And they argue, and they figure out, okay, we're going to build this pile of stones. They called it Mizpah. And this is the line. Here's the line of demarcation. You stay on that side, you'll be okay. I'll stay on this side, we'll be okay. Great in-law relationship, right? You stay over there, I won't kill you. You won't kill me if I'm over here, all right? Okay, we're good. This is the level of relationships that Jacob is dealing with in his life. So they agree to part. Laban goes home. They agree not to mess with each other after this. Jacob continues on his way. Laban is behind him. Esau is ahead. And Jacob gets word that Esau is coming to meet him, but that Esau has 400 warriors with him. Not exactly what you want to hear about the brother you just cheated out of a birthright. This isn't good news. And you see in chapter 32 that God sends a group of angels to protect Jacob, to comfort him. And Jacob actually named the place Mahanaim to commemorate that God's camp was with him. So we guess from the story that difficulties lie ahead. So Jacob, as is customary in his way of thinking, God's called me to this. My brother's upset. I don't know how my dad's going to treat me. I'm going to try to do everything I can to pacify my brother. So what does he do? He sends diplomats ahead of him, and they let him know that he is not interested in all the material birthright, the inheritance. He's only interested in the spiritual. And they make that very clear, and they say, "Oh, my Lord Esau," and they bow down to him, and they show that they are repentant, that Jacob understands he has made a mistake, and he is now coming back, and he's asking for reconciliation. However, Esau is still on the march. Verses 9 through 12, we see that Jacob prays to God and reminds him who called him to come home. I don't know if you can relate to this, but when God has called you to something or to a certain ministry, and all of a sudden you start to experience problems and difficulties, and you pray to God, wait a minute, God, you called me to this, and we're having these problems? Here's Jacob. God, you know what? Okay, I got out of Laban's household, all right, made it out of that one, but now Esau is coming with 400 warriors, and I've got a bunch of children and wives and possessions here. I'm not in a position to fight. Why did you do this? Why did you send me? And it is at this exact time that the dark night of the soul arrives for Jacob. Jacob, the Bible tells us, sent his 4 wives, his 11 sons, and all of his possessions across the Jabbok River. And he stays on the other side of the river to talk to God. The moment of reckoning had come. He had been known as the heel grabber, Jacob, his whole life. In his whole being, he had always tried to connive, to figure out a way to help God in fulfilling the promises he had for him. And so again, he's probably going through the catalog of his brain. What can I do now to bring a blessing out of this cursed situation? Can I craft another plan? Can I do something that will bring about peace? Jacob had suffered 20 years estranged from his families, completely dysfunctional relationship with a father and a brother, never able to see a mother again. And that nagging guilt, that tainted conscience that had haunted him all those years of working in the field for Laban, always going back over the story, going through the moments that he could have done something differently, and living with the guilt that he had deceived his brother and his father in something so important. But we see that he is powerless now to connive anymore. He is powerless to come up with a plan to help him to deal with this situation. He cannot go back and change the past. He can't go and change his brother's heart. He can't go and change his father's perception of him. And so all he has left is to wrestle with God. He knew that God had called him to come home. He knew in his mind that God had blessed him during his time with Laban. So intellectually, and this is why I want us to pay attention, church. Intellectually, Jacob had a relationship with God. Jacob had had moments of understanding salvation, the ladder coming down from heaven, seeing God's blessed hand upon him, even during his time with Laban. He actually had a relationship with God, and he had confessed his sins, and he still had what his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson would call the Apostle Paul, the sin that lives within us. The sin that we are born into. That natural inclination to distrust a loving God. So he begins to talk to God. We don't know what he said. The Bible doesn't give us really any clues into what he said, but going over what I just went over, we can imagine that these were agonized entreaties for God's mercy. Agonized entreaties for God to intervene somehow and bring a blessing out of the situation. And what was the worst thing for Jacob? Could he blame anybody else? Could he say, but God, you did this, but God, I was a victim of this situation? He knew the worst thing about this situation was he knew that he was in this mess because of what he had done himself. He couldn't put the blame on anybody else. It was all him. He could have stood up to his mother. He could have not deceived his father. He could have had a different relationship with his dad. He could have been more trusting in God, that God would somehow bring about this promise. So all he had was to blame himself in this situation. And it wasn't just his fate at stake. Can you imagine Jacob? I want us to put ourselves in his shoes, because now it's not, before he had deceived Esau and he'd, put the goat hair on for his dad, but he just had to face the consequences himself. Now he's got 11 sons, 4 wives, and all these people in his camp, and he has to look at them in the eye, and he knows that their lives are in danger now because of what he had done. Oh, the depths of sin and guilt that humans go to, and the awfulness of what we do with our self-destructive attitudes and behaviors against a loving God who has a better plan, and who had a better plan when we were born. And how many times we go against it. And then we bring ourselves into situations that we have no one to blame for that situation except ourselves. This is the situation of Jacob. And it is at this moment that one of the strangest incidents of all of Scripture occurs. This was a remote place where Jacob was. There were robbers. There were murders, according to historians, that occurred in this part of the country. It was very hilly, and people could hide there, and it was not a safe place. And all of a sudden, when Jacob is facing the consequences on the darkest night of his life, all of a sudden he feels somebody in the back grab his shoulder, and it's an intruder, and they begin to wrestle with him. And he probably is thinking, what in the world, what is the coincidence that on the very moment when I needed encouragement and somebody to stand with me in my life, that I would get attacked by a robber? Maybe it was even Esau himself. How could this be? And he begins to wrestle with all his might, because his life is at stake. Not only his physical life, but his emotional life, his spiritual life, his belief in a loving God is at stake, and he's wrestling. And now he has this physical intruder to wrestle with. And the Bible says they don't go just a few minutes. They go hours. And Jacob is wearing down, and he's thinking, how long can I continue this on? I'm at the end of my rope. I can't do this much longer. Any of you been there? How much longer? I'm about to give in. My life is done. And even if I make it through this night with this intruder, I'm going to have to face the music with my brother and 400 of his soldiers. And in the Middle East, when a brother gets upset with another brother, you just read about places like the Ottoman Empire, when brothers wanted the inheritance from their other brothers. They are brutal. And he's about to give up. his strength is waning. Life is hanging in the balance. And it is at that moment that this intruder, with his finger, touches Jacob's hip and completely breaks it. It comes out of its socket. And Jacob, instead of crying out in despair, realizes he's had an epiphany. This is God. It's God in the flesh. Look at the story. Then the intruder said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob now knows who this is. That this intruder came at just the right moment when he was struggling for hope, when he was wrestling, and all of a sudden this intruder wrestles with him all night, lets him wear down his energy, and when he becomes weak, as his great-grandfather or great-great-great-great-grandson would one day say, Paul, that in his weakness he would become strong because it was God hanging on to him. And you can see what Jacob says, the deceiver. I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he clung to him. He realized he only had one source of power that would be able to help him conquer the darkness that he was facing. And this is a very interesting, look in your Bibles. Look at what the next question is. This doesn't make sense to the Western mind, but let's look at it from an Eastern mind point of view. Because as soon as Jacob says that, I will not let you go unless you bless me, this intruder replies, what is your name? Oh, so they're now going to have a greeting after wrestling for 4 or 5 hours. Yeah, by the way, what is your name? You got to be kidding me. This is the next question after a wrestling match? What is your name? And Jacob replies, according to the DTH version, the Douglas Todd Hardt Bible version translation, I am deceiver, Jacob. You see, Jacob was wrestling with a negative identity that he'd always had, a belief that somehow he wasn't good enough, somehow God would make him work a little bit hard, come up with some conniving plan to get around what his promises said, and somehow he could do it in his own power. And the intruder says this, your name will no longer be Jacob. From now on, you will be called, and this is what it literally means, God prevails. Yisrael. Every time you hear the word Israel, this is where it comes from. It comes from the story when Jacob, the father of the Jewish nation now, was at his darkest point in life, with life hanging in the balance. And God meets him at that moment and says, I'm changing your name so that you will always know that when you cling to me, I prevail. For you have now wrestled with men and with God. And it would be known to the church forever that those of us who cling to God's promises will never suffer defeat. By the way, Jacob asked him his name. And the intruder says, why do you want to know that? And he didn't tell him. For any of you who think that the name of God is important, this is the first story in the Bible we have where God's like, yeah, don't worry about it. My real name. Because it's not my name that's important. God says it's your name. What do you believe about me? Do you believe that I'll meet you in your darkest day? Do you believe that I will bring you through the dark soul of the night? Do you believe that I will never leave you, never forsake you? What is your identity? Is your identity one of a conqueror, going from faith to faith, of being a contagious Christian, of being a victorious Christian, of knowing what lies ahead, that we have a greater day, the second coming is occurring, and God has prepared homes for us where there will be no more death, no more suffering, no more pain. Every tear shall be wiped away. Do you go from victory to victory with that in mind every day? My guess is that God knew that most of us don't. And that we can relate to Jacob, who had a very poor identity of even his faith and had never really, even though he had an intellectual knowledge of faith and of religion and of the Bible stories, had never completely trusted 100% in the saving grace of guess who? Guess who he said he saw? He named the place Peniel after this, for he says, I have seen the face of God. Oh, what love that from heaven descended the second person of the Trinity, that on the darkest night of when he was at the edge of despair and giving up, that Jesus would leave the courts of heaven, even at that time, and come down and spend a whole night and let Jacob wrestle with him until he would show him his power in the morning through his weakness and say, I will prevail for you. What a beautiful story in the Old Testament of grace, of a God who sees and understands our hearts and our minds and our thoughts and is willing to come down and wrestle with us. And if we want to yell at him and shout at him and even curse him, he can take it. And he'll still love you. And he'll still be there for you. So what four things can we take away from this story? Number one, the greatest battle in this world is not on battlefields, it's not in political halls, it's not on school boards, church boards, even in homes. The greatest battle in the world is the battle against self. To fight against our sinful natures and what we want to do and what we want to connive and our nature that naturally distrusts a loving God. Even Jacob had an intellectual understanding of religion, but he still had to, at an emotional, spiritual level, wrestle with God to completely give himself to him and allow him to give him the peace that only God can give. At some point, our experiences in our families, the dysfunction in our families, the dysfunction in our schools, the dysfunction of our religion or maybe even our denomination, at some point we need to just put it all away and say, the main thing is not what the church does and those people in the church or these people in my family or those people in school that told me this or in Uncle Eddie's case, some teacher in second grade told him. I need to overcome. I need to wrestle against this and quit my self-destructive behavior that endangers the people around me and ruins the relationships that I have in my life right now. The greatest battle is not against other people. It's not against governments. It's not against armies. It's against our sinful nature, ourself. Number two, which leads us to why Jacob is an example of overcoming. Because even though he intellectually knew all of this, there was still a point where he had to wrestle with God. And he understood it right before the dawn that it was only God's infinite power that could throw his hip out of whack with one little touch that he could overcome. So the second thing we learn is that it is only by God's power that we overcome. Again, as his great-great-great-grandson Paul would say, the good I want to do, I know I should do, I don't do. The bad that I want to do in Romans 7, that's what I continue to do. He said, who will deliver me from this body of death? Where does the power come from? And in Romans 8:1 it says, but thanks be to Jesus Christ our Lord, who gives us the power to overcome and live fulfilling, joyous, trusting, peace-filled lives through Christ's blood. Jacob was wrestling with grace, which leads us to number three. Even though we are in a grace-based religion, Christianity, believing in Jesus Christ, Jacob shows us in this night of wrestling that there is our part to do in salvation. Again, Jacob had an intellectual knowledge of religion. He had done a lot of good stuff. He was going to be the bearer of the Messiah, his family. He was going to have the birthright blessing. God was blessing him, but he still had the consequences of sin to face, that he needed God's salvation to work his grace through him and his power to work through him and give him that peace to be able to tackle the vicissitudes of life. This is why, again, his great-great-grandson, the Apostle Paul, would one day say, we should all work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Are we afraid of God? No, on the contrary. Jacob was afraid of himself. And he said, unless you bless me, I will not let you go. He clung to him with all that he had. He knew that it was only through the grace of God that he could live a victorious life and even achieve reconciliation with his brother, which, by the way, he does. They ended up weeping on each other's shoulders. And hundreds of people, the 400 soldiers of Esau and the whole household of Jacob, got to see these two basically warlords come together, brothers that were going to go into a deadly battle, have complete reconciliation. Why? Because Jacob had allowed the grace of God to permeate his life. And he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And God touched Esau's heart. And there was peace in the household. The last thing, I'm specifically going to talk to you that have been around the Seventh-day Adventist Church for your whole life, or been to Adventist camps or schools where you've played this silly little game about the end of times, of where the Adventists run to the hills and you play tag with all the other bad guys who come and chase you after the Sunday law is issued. And in our church, there is an unhealthy, in many pockets of the church, unhealthy fear of the end of times. And I've talked to many church members who say, I'm so scared. I just want the Lord to take me before this time. It's going to be so bad. And then there's a preoccupation of coming up with charts and figuring out everything that's going to lead up to it. And then we have whole ministries that are dedicated to showing everything that certain churches are doing and saying. Let me read to you from Jeremiah 30, verse 7, where it talks about the end of times, this time, and not that there won't be a crisis in the end of time. There is. We know Satan, the Revelation tells us he's upset because he knows his time is short. He's about done. He's had all this time to play with the human race, and God said, no, you're going to have this end time, but you got one last shot. Okay, so Satan marshals all his forces to have this one last attempt. And this is what it says. Alas, that day is great. So great that there is none like it. Multiple places in the Bible say there will be a time of trouble as there never has been before. It is a time of distress for Jacob. Not Israel, Jacob. So when the Bible talks about the end of times, who does it associate it with, and what story in the Bible does it associate the end of times with? This story. This story. The Bible associates the time of trouble that we will have to live through with this night of wrestling with God, which, by the way, at the end of the night, do you think Jacob was so concerned about Esau? He was about to be killed by this intruder. He had forgotten probably about Esau. He was concerned about his relationship with God, and he was wrestling with the intruder who knew that his greatest thought on his mind was that it was his sin that had caused all of this, and maybe a holy, perfect God would not accept him. And so Jacob wrestled. And Jesus came down from the courts of heaven to show that anybody who comes to him, as he said later, I will no wise cast out, and if you take a hold of me, I will overcome for you. And that's what's tied to the end of times. And these are in the next words. Yet he shall be saved out of it. There is nothing to fear for the future except that we don't cling to God today. Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow even. Every day's got enough problems. And yet sometimes in our church we build up this future as if it's going to be something that we can't make it through. If you cling to Jesus today, there is not a trial in this world that will be able to take you out of his hand. All of the suffering that you've gone through, all of the despair about your own religious life, all the religious experiences you've had, all the trauma and the dysfunction you might have encountered in your family or maybe in church life or school life, maybe the bullying that happened. If you put your hand in Jesus' hand, just remember Jacob. He had his name changed to Israel. And Jesus offers us that same victory today. He says, if you put your hand in mine, I will never leave you, never forsake you, and I have something more grand and glorious than you can imagine if you put your hand in my hand. Church, have you wrestled with God?